Black Pine Archives. Some roads in the Appalachian Mountains did not lead anywhere new. They only taught you how to return. In this episode, there were 9 case files drawn from backroads, hollers, ridgelines, and service cuts, where maps became suggestions and signal behaved like a hand on a throat. Each account was partially verified through journals, device logs, county replies, photographs, inspection notes, and recordings that should have been ordinary. They were not. If you want more archived case files like these, subscribe to Black Pine Archives and stay to the end. In more than one of these stories, the proof was not a feeling. It was a physical artifact that still exists. Eli Mercer drove contract freight in the Appalachian corridor, the way some people worked a second job, quietly, repetitively, and with a deep respect for what could go wrong when no one was watching. He ran small pallet loads between mill towns and distribution lots, the kind of routes that looked easy on a daytime map and turned strange after midnight. He kept 2 flashlights in the cab, carried a paper atlas even though he hated unfolding it, and wrote mileage and fuel use in a spiral notebook because he had learned that electronics failed more often than memory did. The cut-through he chose that night was not a secret. It was a county connector that locals treated like a convenience with an asterisk. It shaved time when the highway was clogged or when a storm pushed traffic into a crawl. But it came with advice that sounded like superstition and usually arrived from older drivers with steady eyes. Do not take it tired. Do not take it in heavy fog. Do not take it if you had less than half a tank. And if you saw the bridge, do not stop on it. Eli had heard those warnings before. He had ignored them before, too. He was not reckless, just practical. And practical people sometimes mistook familiarity for safety. The GPS agreed with his decision. It drew a clean line from the interstate exit to a weave of county roads, then onto a narrow connector that dipped toward a creek. The screen showed a confident route and a confident estimate. Eli watched the remaining miles count down and listened to the low, steady noise of the engine, like a heartbeat. The bridge arrived without drama the first time. It was a low crossing over shallow water, wood planks damp with night moisture, and steel rails stained with rust that looked almost black under headlights. The creek below made a soft sound, not loud enough to be a warning, just present. There were no reflectors, there was no fresh paint. It was the sort of neglected infrastructure that stayed in service because no one wanted to pay to replace it. On the right-hand guard, a single scratch caught his light. It was not deep enough to compromise the rail, but it was new enough to shine. It looked like the curved kiss of a bumper or the glancing bite of a trailer corner, one bright arc against a band of dull weathering. Eli noted it the way drivers noted anything that might matter later. He felt a small comfort in it because it meant a landmark existed, and landmarks meant orientation. He crossed, climbed the grade, and continued into the forest, where the road narrowed and the shoulders softened into wet leaf litter. For a while, nothing changed except the quality of darkness. Trees pressed closer. The sound of the highway faded until it felt imaginary. Then the GPS behavior shifted in a way Eli would later describe as a system trying to act normal. The map did not blank. It did not crash. It kept showing his blue dot moving forward. The miles kept ticking. The arrival time still made sense. The only thing that felt wrong was the road itself, because he started seeing the same drainage dip twice, then again, and the same bent sapling at the edge of his light like a hooked finger pointing. Eli told himself that the road had loops that county connectors sometimes did. He told himself the terrain forced curves. He told himself he had simply misremembered the sapling. The road dipped again toward water. The bridge appeared a second time, and the scratch on the right rail was identical. Same curve, same fresh shine, same length and angle, as if someone had traced it with a template. Eli felt his throat tighten in that quiet way it did, before fear rose fully into the chest. He checked his odometer. He checked the GPS. Both suggested he had traveled forward. Both suggested he should not be here. He crossed anyway because drivers crossed obstacles when they could not afford to stop. He told himself the bridge was a coincidence. He told himself the scratch was a common mark. He told himself the simplest story. It was only after the third appearance that he began documenting. He wrote in his spiral notebook with the pen he kept clipped to the visor. He did not write feelings, he wrote facts. He wrote time, fuel level, and the presence of the scratch. He wrote that the creek smelled like iron and wet wood. He wrote that the air changed near the bridge, cooler and heavier, as if the valley held its own temperature. Loop observed 3 times. From the driver's journal, Eli tried to break the pattern the way people broke panic. He narrowed it into steps. He decided to test the route with controlled choices. He turned around before the bridge and drove back the way he believed he had come. He watched his rear view for the sapling. He watched for the drainage dip. He watched for any sign that the road behind him contained the same landmarks it had before. The forest refused to offer him a reliable sequence. The sapling appeared, but on the wrong side. The drainage dip felt shallower. The road seemed smoother in places where it should have been rutted. He reached the bridge again from the opposite direction. The scratch was still on the right rail. He turned around after the bridge and crossed back, then stopped and reversed slowly, watching the wood planks pass under his headlights as if he could read them like a barcode. The bridge did not change. The creek did not change. The scratch did not change. He made a mark on his steering wheel with the tip of his pen, a small line at the top center to ensure his own hands were not lying to him. He made a second mark on the dashboard, a reference point. He spoke his next actions into a voice memo because he knew memory could be persuaded by stress. I kept turning different ways, but it kept giving me the bridge back. From a phone voice memo, he attempted a third method. He stopped on the far side of the bridge, pulled onto the shoulder, and got out to examine the scratch at close range. The night air felt damp and still. The creek sound seemed quieter when he stepped away from his cab, as if the sound was part of the bridge and not the water. Up close, the scratch looked less like a random impact and more like a mark made deliberately. It contained 3 shallow lines inside the deeper arc, evenly spaced, like a tri-point contact that had slid at speed. Eli ran a gloved finger along the metal and felt the edges catch. The metal was cooler than it should have been for a rail that had been in the same air as his warm engine. He took a photo. The flash lit up the rail and the scratch shone back too brightly, an almost wet shine that did not match the rest of the rust. In the background of the photo, the road behind him looked strangely smooth, like a surface that did not want to hold detail. He returned to the cab and checked his GPS track. The line looked normal at a glance. When he zoomed in, the shape became wrong. It had overlaid itself with clean precision, the same loop drawn repeatedly, not messy the way real driving looked, but stacked as if the device had been guided. Eli exported the navigation log later and saw the same thing with more clarity. A repeating path, identical coordinates revisited with unnerving accuracy, like a record stuck on a single groove. GPS track repeats. From a navigation log export, the fuel gauge continued to drop. This became the most convincing part of the experience because fuel was physical and did not care about fear. Eli watched the needle move in a way that did not match the distance he could swear he had driven. The engine heat remained, the cab warm, the tires making the same soft crackle over gravel, but the landscape insisted on the bridge. He considered sleeping in the cab until morning. He considered walking. He considered calling for help. He attempted a call to emergency services anyway, knowing he was in a dead zone because humans reached for other voices when reality became uncertain. His phone showed 1 bar briefly, like a cruel invitation. The call connected thinly and then broke into static. The dispatcher system would later show a partial connection, a fragment of audio, and a sudden drop. Caller reported a repeated bridge crossing and then silence. From an emergency call log summary, Eli changed strategy again. Instead of trying to solve the loop, he tried to stop feeding it. He turned off the GPS voice prompts. He covered the screen. He chose to drive as if he were navigating by terrain, not by instruction. He took the next side spur that looked least logical, a narrow climb that seemed too rough for his load. His tires spun briefly in mud. He kept steady pressure, refusing to gun it. He climbed. At the top of the grade, the forest opened for a moment into a wider cut where the wind existed again. He felt it on his face through the cracked window, a small, normal draft that smelled like pine and cold. His phone pinged once. The GPS map refreshed with new detail, as if it had been allowed to see the world again. Behind him, the road that had held the bridge did not show on the map with the same confidence. It was present but faint, as if it were an optional suggestion rather than a real line. Eli drove until he reached pavement and lights, and the reassuring geometry of main roads. He did not stop until he hit a truck pull-off with cameras and other vehicles. Then he sat and wrote everything down while it was still sharp. In the morning, he contacted the county road department with the politeness of a man asking for something he knew he would not receive: confirmation. Their reply came back bland and professionally final. No detour had been posted. No work order existed. No closure had been announced. The bridge was in service. The road was in service. No detour posted. From a county response email. A deputy took Eli's statement and requested the photo. The deputy also asked for the GPS export, the journal entry, and the voice memo. The case file built a ladder of evidence that should have forced the story into something mundane. It did not. The bridge was inspected later that week. The scratch was still there, bright against rust. The rails showed no fresh collision damage beyond that mark. The boards were damp, as expected. The creek flowed as expected. The road approached and departed as expected. What did not match expectation was the pattern of tire marks near the bridge. The deputy noted ruts that appeared to begin, loop, and overlap, with a cleanliness that did not match normal traffic, as if the vehicles that made them had driven the exact same line repeatedly without drift. Eli was not blamed. He was not ridiculed. He was filed under route confusion and fatigue, because those were categories that kept paperwork stable. But the photo and the GPS export remained attached to the report. They remained because the artifacts were easier to store than the feeling Eli described in his final addendum. He wrote that the bridge did not feel like a place. It felt like a function, a return point, a reset. He wrote that each time he saw the scratch, it looked slightly newer, as if it refreshed itself. After that night, Eli stopped using shortcuts. He began fueling earlier than necessary, not because he feared running out, but because he feared the proof of fuel loss while going nowhere. He started photographing odd marks on guardrails and keeping them in a folder labeled for his own sanity. And whenever he crossed any bridge in the mountains after midnight, he found his eyes drifting to the right rail, searching for a fresh arc of metal that looked like it wanted to be recognized. Archival transition. The next file arrived with a photo attachment and one sentence in the subject line. The sign had not existed until it did. Story 2. The sign with the wrong font. Nolan Reddick drove a white service van for a rural telecom contractor, the kind of outfit that handled the jobs bigger companies avoided because the mileage did not justify the effort. He replaced weathered cokes, re-terminated corroded connections, and climbed small ridge sites where towers blinked above tree lines like patient eyes. His work trained him to notice infrastructure the way a proofreader noticed spelling. When something was off, it did not just look wrong, it read wrong. The dispatch ticket that afternoon was ordinary. A dead zone complaint, the sort that could mean anything from a downed amplifier to a loose fitting or a customer who did not understand how hills blocked signal. The notes included a rural address and a coordinate pin. The route sent him off a state road and onto a narrow cut that dipped into heavier timber. Late spring in the Appalachians had a particular look. The green was aggressive, dense enough to swallow distance. The air held moisture even when it was not raining. Shadows under the canopy came early and stayed. Nolan drove with his window cracked, listening for the subtle changes his body recognized before his mind did. Gravel under tires, a shift in wind, the way sound thinned when you entered a valley pocket. He expected signal to weaken as he went in. He expected his phone to show fewer bars. That was normal. Half a mile in, he saw the sign. It stood at a bend like it had been installed for him. Specifically, the post was new pressure-treated wood, straight and clean. No bullet scars, no weather bleaching, no moss at the base. The reflective face was unblemished. The text was simple and short, the kind of warning that county roads carried when they wanted to discourage outsiders. But the typography was wrong. The letters were too tall and too narrow, with proportions Nolan associated with older highway systems or entirely different jurisdictions. The spacing looked slightly off, as if someone had recreated a familiar standard from memory and gotten the details wrong. The reflective film had a clean sheen that didn't match the grime of the surrounding road signs, as if it had never been exposed to dust. Nolan slowed without meaning to. His eyes did what they always did. Verify. He glanced at the fasteners, expecting mismatched bolts or signs of tampering. The mounting hardware looked fresh. The edges of the sign looked factory cut. It carried no county identifier, no sticker, no sign code. It was official in form, but missing the small marks that made official things traceable. He took the bend. The moment his front tires crossed the point where the road began to curve past the sign, his phone lost signal so completely it did not even show searching. It went empty in a single step, like a switch had been flipped. He checked instinctively, the way people checked for injury after a sudden stop, and found something more disturbing than dead bars. His diagnostic app, which logged connectivity changes for work notes, recorded the drop as abrupt and absolute. Signal drop at marker. From a phone diagnostic log, his radio did not simply hiss either. Static was familiar. Static was honest. What came through his speaker sounded occupied, like something was holding the channel open without speaking. There was a low, steady presence under the noise, a pressure that made Nolan think of an open mic left keyed by mistake. He tried to call dispatch anyway, even though he knew it would not go through clean. The transmit indicator lit. The air did not respond. He cycled the radio power. He changed frequencies. He checked the antenna lead where it ran into the dashboard. He tapped the connector with a knuckle as if that could persuade electrons. Nothing changed. The interference felt local. It did not blanket the entire ridge. It wrapped around the bend like a boundary you could cross in one tire rotation. Radio interference localized. From a field note entered later, Nolan did what technicians did when a system became unreliable. He tested the edges. He rolled forward 3 van lengths and stopped. No signal. He rolled backward carefully until he could see the sign fully in his mirrors. Still nothing. The forest pressed close on both sides, thick with undergrowth, and the road itself felt narrower than it had a minute earlier, though he could not prove that with anything but nerves. Then he reversed farther, past the bend, past the invisible threshold. The instant his rear tires crossed back, his phone woke. Bars returned. Notifications stacked and poured in, arriving all at once as if they had been waiting on the other side of a gate. His radio snapped back to normal static, then a weak fragment of a weather band, then his own channel. The contrast was too clean. Dead zones in these mountains were messy. They faded, they fluttered, they came in and out as you moved. This had a hard line. Nolan drove forward again just to confirm he was not imagining the boundary. He crossed the bend, watched the bars vanish, watched the radio become occupied. He backed up. Signal returned exactly at the same point. He sat with his hands on the wheel, engine idling, and felt his mind begin to build excuses because excuses were safer than patterns. A ridge shadow, a metal deposit in the rock, a malfunctioning amplifier nearby, an unusual pocket of electromagnetic interference, a tower being tested, a convoy of logging equipment running illegal transmitters. But none of those explanations accounted for the sign. He photographed it. The picture came out crisp. In the image, the wrong font looked even stranger, almost too sharp, too deliberate, like it wanted to be noticed. The reflective surface held a faint pattern near the lower edge, visible only at a specific angle. 3 small dots aligned under the text, like a maker's mark. The dots were not random, they were spaced evenly, a neat row of 3. Nolan moved his headlights and took a second photo to confirm the dots were not glare. They remained. He recorded a quick voice memo for himself, not because he wanted drama, but because he had learned that experiences without documentation became jokes by the time they reached an office. It was like a boundary you could cross in one tire rotation. From a technician's voice memo, he did not continue deeper into that cut. He reported back to dispatch that he would approach the complaint from the other side, by a longer route, citing equipment interference and safety concerns. The dispatcher accepted it with minimal argument. Rural jobs taught everyone to respect a worker's instinct, even if no one admitted it outright. Over the next 2 weeks, Nolan asked around in the cautious way contractors did, pretending it was casual curiosity. He mentioned a strange dead pocket near a bend. He did not mention the font at first. He waited to see if anyone volunteered details. The pattern emerged anyway. A sign appeared where it should not be. Signal died. Radio behaved like a hand gripping a wire. People described it differently, but the sequence remained consistent across accounts. Other drivers report same. From a compiled interview summary, Nolan did what systems people did when stories started aligning. He attempted verification. He sent the photo to the county road office with a polite note asking whether any signage had been installed on that cut. The response came back the next morning. No work order, no installation record, no approved signage. They asked for a location. He sent the coordinate pin, careful and precise. The county sent a crew. They returned with no findings, no sign, no post hole, no disturbed shoulder, no fresh wood, no reflective face. The bend existed. The road existed. The forest looked ordinary. The crew reported typical weak signal in the area. Nothing worth escalating. Nolan drove out himself the following weekend with the photo loaded on his phone like a reference image. He found the bend easily. He found the spot where the sign had stood. There was nothing. No cut marks in the grass, no new dirt, no footprint of installation. It looked like the shoulder had never been touched. He parked and walked the edge, searching for any clue that could let the rational world reclaim the story. He did not find one. He tested signal anyway. He crossed the threshold where he remembered it dying. This time his phone weakened gradually, the normal way, and his radio behaved like a radio in mountains. Noisy, intermittent, imperfect. The boundary was gone. Nolan kept the photo. He kept the diagnostic log. He kept the field note. He kept the interview summary he had compiled for himself. He had enough pieces to know something had happened, but not enough to prove it in the way the county required. After that, he began noticing typography in the wild. He noticed when a sign's proportions did not match its purpose. He noticed when reflective film looked too new for its surroundings. He noticed when posts looked planted rather than grown into their place. He still took ridge routes. He still accepted that the mountains ate signal the way they ate daylight. But he learned something he did not enjoy learning. Sometimes the boundary announced itself first, and only then did the world go quiet. Archival transition, the third file, began as a map mismatch and ended as a drone video that should have made the entire situation easier to explain. It did not. Mara Sloan ran volunteer search coordination the way some people ran a small business. Organized, redundant, and quietly prepared for everything to go wrong at once. She kept mapping apps on her phone and printed backups in her glove compartment. She carried spare batteries, a laminated county road index, and a small binder of past incidents labeled by ridge name and date. She trusted the mountains, but she trusted process more. The missing hiker call came in during a stretch of fair weather that made people reckless. A solo day hike that became an overnight when the subject failed to return, then became a search when the family waited too long to make the report. The last confirmed sighting put the hiker near a ridge tract used by timber crews, an area threaded with old spur roads and half-maintained connectors that looked inviting on a map and turned mean on foot. Mara pulled up the parcel overlay first, then added the terrain shading, then dropped in the old Forest Service layer her team used for historical roads. On her screen, a small structure icon sat in a clearing a mile off the ridgeline. It was not unusual for outbuildings and hunting cabins to appear in the data. What made her pause was the annotation attached to the icon, a plain, generic label that implied the structure had been recognized by the system without ever being properly named. She called one of the responders who knew the tract by memory and asked if there was a cabin near that clearing. The answer came fast and confident. There was nothing there. No cabin, no trailer, no squatter's lean-to. The clearing existed, but it was empty. Mara stared at the icon until it stopped feeling like a symbol and started feeling like a contradiction. She drove to the coordinates in the late afternoon, with the sun angled low enough to make every blade of grass look sharp. The spur road into the tract was passable but rough, rutted by logging trucks and patched in places with loose gravel that shifted under her tires. The air smelled of warm pine resin and damp soil. Birds moved in short bursts and then went still. At the clearing, she parked and walked the perimeter slowly, scanning for what the icon promised. There was no foundation, no driveway, no mailbox, no path worn into the grass, no utility pole, no cut stump line that suggested a site had been cleared for a building. It was sunlit and ordinary in a way that almost felt rehearsed. Then she noticed the soil. Near the center of the clearing, a pale rectangle of disturbed earth sat like a scar. The shape was too clean and too geometric to be a random patch of erosion. It looked as if something heavy had been there recently and had been lifted away without leaving debris. No broken boards, no nails, no scraps of insulation. Just a neat, smooth impression that held the faint smell of turned dirt. Mara took a screenshot of her map and circled the structure icon, annotating it with time and coordinate notes the way she did when she wanted her future self to trust her present self. Map mismatch. From a captured screen image, she took photos of the clearing from multiple angles, then knelt at the edge of the pale rectangle and pressed her fingers into the soil. It was cool and slightly compacted, like it had been compressed and then allowed to settle. She expected to find grit from gravel or fragments from a cinder block. She found none. It was clean dirt, almost too clean. Back at the county office that evening, she requested a registry check. The clerk on duty was the kind of person who treated database work like a ritual. He entered coordinates searched by parcel boundary, then widened to surrounding lots. He checked archived building permits, utility hookups, and recorded easements. Nothing matched. The system insisted the land was unbuilt. The clearing existed as open tract. There was no property number associated with a structure, no utility history, no tax record indicating improvements, no parcel record. From a county registry note, Mara filed the mismatch into the search packet anyway, because missing hikers did not care whether contradictions were inconvenient. She added the map screenshot. She added the clearing photos. She added the registry note. She logged it all as an anomaly worth revisiting once the subject was found, because oddities sometimes became clues after the fact. 2 days later, a drone volunteer offered to sweep the ridgeline for heat signatures and visual anomalies. The county had a small, unofficial network of licensed hobbyists who helped when terrain made ground search slow. The volunteer met the team at a turnout and launched the drone with practiced calm, the craft rising into the canopy gap and then forward into a layered green that made distance hard to judge. The drone feed showed the clearing exactly as Mara had seen it, empty, sunlit, ordinary. Then, half a mile deeper into timber, where Mara's map showed nothing but contour lines and shaded relief, the drone camera caught a building. It was not a ruin. It was not a collapsed shed. It was squared, intact, and tucked under the canopy, as if it had been built with concealment in mind. The roofline was clean. The walls looked straight. A faint metallic glint appeared near where a number plate would usually be fixed by a door. The structure was small, but it sat with the stubborn presence of something that belonged. The drone operator tagged the location and saved the clip, adding metadata notes about altitude, direction, and approximate distance from the nearest known spur. Structure visible on drone. From flight video metadata summary, Mara watched the footage on a phone screen and felt the specific unease that came from layered evidence. The clearing icon had promised a structure where none existed. Now the drone had found a structure where the map promised nothing. The contradictions did not cancel each other out. They stacked. Responders hiked in the next morning, guided by the drone coordinate tag. The trail was not a trail so much as a line of effort through brush, the kind of off-grid approach that left people sweating and scratched, even in mild temperatures. Mara went with them because she could not stomach handing this one off to someone else. If she was wrong, she wanted to be wrong in person. The coordinate led them to a patch of timber that looked like any other patch of timber. Then it opened into a subtle pocket, where the ground was strangely even, the understory oddly sparse. There was no building, not abandoned, not hidden, not there at all. But the ground remembered it. A neat imprint of a foundation sat in the needle bed, edges crisp enough to suggest recent weight. Pine needles were compressed into a flat plane inside the rectangle, and the soil beneath showed a faint outline of where footings might have been. The air smelled slightly different inside the pocket, like damp metal and old wood. But when Mara crouched and inhaled again, the scent slid away and became ordinary forest. She walked the perimeter with slow steps and found marks that should not have existed without a structure to make them. A line where needles were pushed aside as if a door had swung. A shallow groove in the soil that might have been from repeated foot traffic. A spot near the rectangle's edge where the needles were disturbed as if something heavy had been dragged and then lifted. Then she saw the plaque fragment. It lay half buried in leaf litter, a broken piece of metal with a stamped sequence of numbers and characters that did not match any county registry format. The stamping was crisp, the edges sharp where it had snapped, and the metal felt strangely warm when Mara picked it up, despite the shade and cool air. The warmth did not behave like sun heat. It felt held, like it had been kept close to something living. She bagged the fragment in a marked evidence pouch, hands steady by habit even as her stomach tightened. Back at staging, Mara built the packet the way she always did, stacking facts into a ladder designed to produce clarity. She placed her map screenshot first, then the registry note, then the drone footage stills with coordinate tags, then the field photos of the Foundation imprint, then the physical artifact, the plaque fragment. Witness, screen proof, county record, drone fixation, physical plaque. It should have narrowed possibilities. Instead, it widened them into something more uncomfortable. Mara wrote her summary in restrained language, careful not to outrun what the evidence could support. She avoided words like impossible. She avoided words like haunted. She wrote that the structure appeared inconsistently across mapping layers and aerial footage, and that ground inspection revealed physical traces without the structure present. She wrote that the artifact did not match county formats and required further analysis. Then, in a private note she did not submit into the official file, she wrote the thought she could not stop having. If a building could be visible on a drone but absent on foot, or absent on a map but present in timber, then the problem was not location. It was permission. That same week, the missing hiker was found alive, 2 ridges over, dehydrated and sunburned, with no coherent memory of the nights spent out. The resolution should have made the rest feel less urgent. It did not. Because when Mara returned home and opened her map app again, the structure icon in the clearing was gone. The overlay looked clean, as if it had never been marked. Only the screenshot in her phone gallery proved that it ever existed. The plaque fragment remained in an evidence locker, labeled and cataloged. When a clerk later attempted to run the stamped sequence through county systems as a cross-reference, the entry field rejected it as invalid format, refusing to save the query. Mara kept coordinating searches. She kept printing backups. She kept trusting process, but she also started carrying a second set of maps, ones she did not share widely, built from screenshots and anomalies because she learned something the system did not want to admit. Sometimes the mountains did not erase people. Sometimes they erased the proof that they had been there. Archival transition. The 4th file revolved around a single time reading that appeared on more than one device, more than one surface, and more than one receipt. Tessa Ward ran overnight deliveries for a small convenience distributor whose routes were stitched through hollers and ridge cuts where cell service came and went like weather. She drove a box truck that smelled faintly of cardboard and diesel, no matter how often it was cleaned. Her life was measured in stop logs, temperature checks, and the small rituals that kept a driver awake. Mints in the cup holder, a thermos within reach, a playlist kept low enough to hear the engine change its mood. She knew the valley station by habit. It sat at the bottom of a long grade, a pocket of lights in a place where the mountains pressed close and made every sound feel trapped. She had not been down there in months because another driver usually took that run. But on a midsummer night when a coworker called out and dispatch was short-staffed, Tessa took the spur without arguing. The descent felt normal at first. The road was a narrow ribbon, patched in places, with tree limbs reaching overhead like a tunnel. Her headlights caught dust and insects and the pale flash of reflective markers nailed to posts. The air cooled as she dropped in elevation, heavy with damp vegetation. Halfway down, her dashboard clock caught her eye. It read 3:17 a.m. She frowned, not because the time itself was odd, but because she had checked it less than 10 minutes earlier, and it had not been anywhere near that. She tapped the clock face once, the way people did when they wanted a device to admit it had made a mistake. It did not change. She glanced at her phone. 3:17 a.m. She glanced at the small digital watch she wore out of habit, a cheap thing with a cracked screen corner. 3:17 a.m. The convergence was too neat to ignore. Different devices, different power sources, different internal clocks, all agreeing with a confidence that felt staged. At the bottom of the grade, the station came into view. It was brighter than she remembered, the lights harsh against the dark timberline, as if the valley demanded to be seen. Over the door, a red digital sign that normally cycled promotions showed a single static display, 3:17 a.m. The numbers were large, crisp, and unwavering. They did not blink, they did not count. They simply declared. Tessa parked under the canopy and sat for a moment, with both hands on the wheel, listening to the engine idle, trying to decide whether she was tired enough to be seeing patterns that weren't there. She stepped out anyway because deliveries did not care about dread. Inside, the station smelled of hot fryer grease and old coffee. A small refrigerated case hummed. The air conditioner ran too cold, raising goosebumps on her forearms. The clerk behind the counter looked up the way someone looked up at any late-night customer, then looked away without interest, as if Tessa's arrival was not a new event, but part of an expected loop. Tessa grabbed a bottle of water and a pack of gum, not because she needed them, but because she wanted a receipt. Paper was real. Paper could anchor her. The register beeped. The printer whined. The receipt slid out warm and curled slightly from fresh heat. At the top, under the store name, the time printed in plain black ink, 3:17, Tessa stared at it long enough that the numbers began to feel like a dare. Time mismatch noted. From Tessa's journal entry, she stepped outside again, holding the receipt like proof that she was not alone inside her own perception. The valley was quiet except for insects and the faint, distant rush of creek water somewhere beyond the trees. Crickets sang in a steady pattern that did not shift with her movement, as if the sound was not coming from individual bodies but from the valley itself. She checked her phone's network settings. No service, which was normal for the area. But the location indicator still worked. Her map dot showed her in the right valley, at the right station. The map did not lie about where she was. It only refused to admit what time it might be anywhere else. Her phone attempted to correct itself, the way smart devices did when something seemed wrong. A small notification flashed that it was syncing time to network. The notification disappeared, then returned, then vanished again. The system log later recorded what her eyes could not hold on to in the moment. Phone auto time failed. From a device system log, Tessa returned to her truck and started the route as planned, moving deeper through the valley to drop off product at a smaller satellite store that should have been just a few minutes farther down the road. She had driven this valley enough to picture the turns in her head. A left at the second culvert, a mild S-curve, then a straightaway that always smelled like wet stone. She drove. The road rolled under her tires. The odometer ticked up. The fuel gauge dropped the way it always did, except it seemed to fall too fast, the needle sliding as if she was paying a hidden cost to keep moving. Then the station appeared again. Same canopy, same harsh lights, same red digital sign over the door, 3:17 a.m. She did not slam the brakes. She did not swear. She simply slowed until the truck crawled and her brain caught up with what her eyes were telling it. She had not turned around. She had not taken an exit. She had driven forward on a road that should have led away. Still, the valley returned her to its single bright landmark, like a hand guiding a toy back to the start of a track. Tessa forced herself into procedure. She marked her steering wheel with a thin pen line. She reset her trip odometer. She noted the exact fuel level. She opened her phone's notes app and typed short, clipped observations, because writing in the moment made it harder for the mind to rewrite events later. She drove again, deliberately choosing different speeds, different lanes within the narrow roadway, different behavior at curves. She turned on her high beams and scanned for side roads she might be missing. There were none, just trees and darkness, and occasional reflectors that appeared too evenly spaced to be random. The station returned again, 3:17. She walked inside a second time, receipt from the first purchase still in her pocket. The clerk glanced at her with the mild expression of someone who had seen this behavior before, or who had stopped treating it as strange. Tessa did not ask direct questions. Direct questions made things confrontational. She asked the way a tired driver asked when she wanted confirmation without starting a scene. She pointed toward the sign with her chin, then toward her phone. The clerk's response was minimal, but he did not deny it. Later, when the county deputy took a statement after Tessa filed a formal report, the clerk's written words were careful and plain. The kind of language used by someone who did not want to make the world bigger than it already was. Station owner confirms issue. From a written statement, Tessa returned to the truck with the second receipt. It also read 3:17. She held both slips side by side under the canopy light. They were separate transactions, separate timestamps, the ink equally fresh, as if the printer lived in a loop just as tightly as the road. She tried calling out. She tried the truck radio. The valley answered with silence and static that felt too clean. She tried rolling her truck past the station without stopping, as if refusing to acknowledge the landmark might break the pattern. It did not. She found herself back under the canopy again, watching the red sign insist on its one truth, 3:17 a.m. The longer she stayed, the more the valley felt less like a place and more like a function. It took movement and returned a fixed output. It took fuel and returned the same light. It took minutes and returned none. Even her body began to react as if time was being held too tightly. Her eyes burned from unblinking focus. Her stomach felt hollow in a way that did not match her last meal. Fatigue pressed behind her forehead, yet her watch refused to grant permission for another minute to pass. She made a decision that did not feel logical but felt correct. Instead of following the main valley road, she turned onto a side grade that looked wrong for her truck. The entry was narrow, the incline steep, and the gravel loose. It was the kind of road you avoided unless you had no other option. It was also the kind of road that did not feel like it belonged to the valley's loop. It felt like it belonged to the ridge above it, to a different set of rules. Tessa climbed. Her tires slipped once, then bit. The engine strained and the truck shuddered as it found traction. For a moment she thought the incline would stall her and leave her stranded in darkness between the valley and the ridge, a place where even the station's lights would not reach. Then she crested the rise. It happened immediately, like a switch thrown hard. Her phone clock jumped forward in one harsh correction, skipping minutes it could not account for. The dashboard clock blinked, went dark for a heartbeat, then resumed with a new time. Her watch, stubbornly simple, advanced as if it had been holding its breath. Behind her, down the grade, the valley lights looked smaller than they should have, and the station's red sign was no longer readable from that distance. The air changed too, less damp, less heavy, as if the ridge had its own weather and the valley had been a sealed room. Tessa did not stop until she reached a paved road that felt familiar under her tires. Only then did she pull over, hands shaking more from delayed reaction than immediate fear. She opened her glove compartment and placed the receipts inside a clear evidence sleeve she normally used for delivery paperwork. She wrote the location in longhand on the sleeve, then added the time printed on both slips. 3:17 days later, when the case file was assembled, those receipts became the artifact that made the story hardest to dismiss. Paper did not share hallucinations. Ink did not drift. A receipt was a machine's version of truth, stamped and recorded. The ink did not fade the way cheap thermal printing often did. Months later, the time remained legible, as if the paper had been preserved in a cooler, protected from heat and sunlight. Tessa kept driving deliveries. She kept taking back routes, but she stopped going down that spur road. And on nights when her dashboard clock caught her eye at the wrong moment, she found herself holding her breath, waiting to see whether the next minute would arrive. Archival transition, the fifth file contained video of a ribbon that behaved like a compass needle, pointing toward a ridge even when the air was still. Garrett Pike volunteered with a trail maintenance crew that handled the unglamorous work of keeping the mountains passable. He cleared blowdowns, refreshed faded blazes, and replaced rotten steps on steep grades. He knew the practical truths of wilderness, the way mechanics knew engines, how weather changed faster than forecasts, how smoke could slide along a slope instead of rising, how falling leaves could make a trail look like it turned when it did not. He also knew what calm looked like. In early fall, on a weekday morning when most hikers were at work, Garrett hiked alone to check a section that had taken a late summer storm. The sky was a flat, clean gray, the kind that promised no rain but made everything look washed and close. The air shifted between cool pockets and faint warmth where the sun found gaps in the canopy. The trees stood still. No canopy sway, no needle whisper, no sound of wind moving through the upper branches. He carried the usual: a folding saw, work gloves, a small first aid kit, a phone with a trail app, and a roll of bright ribbon tape for marking hazards crews would return to later. Ribbon tape was simple and reliable. Tie it to a branch and it hung slack unless weather intervened. That day, the ribbon did not behave like ribbon. Near a switchback that faced a long ridgeline, Garrett found a downed limb that had partially blocked the trail. He cleared what he could, then chose a nearby branch to mark the spot for the crew that would bring larger tools. He tied a length of ribbon around the branch with a quick knot, expecting it to droop and flutter a little. Instead, it snapped tight, not in a gust, not in a flicker. It pulled straight out from the branch as if a steady wind had caught it and refused to let go. The ribbon stretched into a clean line, vibrating faintly with tension. It pointed toward a specific ridge line across the hollow, unwavering like a compass needle that had decided wind was direction. Garrett stepped back and watched for the obvious explanation. He waited for treetops to move. He listened for wind in the leaves. Nothing answered. The canopy remained still. The air on his face felt neutral, yet the ribbon stayed tight, pulled so hard it began to twist at the knot. He raised his phone and filmed because he could feel how quickly his own mind would try to smooth this into something ordinary later. Directional flow constant. From a recorded field note, he walked a small circle around the branch. The ribbon did not follow him. It did not shift to match a new angle. It remained oriented toward that ridge, as if the pull did not belong to the space around him, but to a single point somewhere ahead. He reached out and pinched the ribbon between thumb and forefinger. The tension was real, not imagined. It felt like holding onto a line stretched by weight, not by air. Garrett did what careful people did when reality offered a choice between fear and testing. He tested. He held a single match, struck it, and let it burn down until it produced a thin stream of smoke. In a calm forest, smoke drifted, hesitated, curled, then dispersed. Here, it did not. The smoke pulled in one direction as if sucked into a vacuum. It formed a narrow, clean stream and slid toward the ridge. It did not diffuse. It did not wander. It behaved like a thread being reeled in. Garrett snapped the match out and watched the last of the smoke get taken with the same stubborn intent. He moved laterally, several steps away from the ribbon-marked branch, and repeated the test. The pull weakened slightly. He stepped closer to the line of sight with the ridge and repeated it again. And the pull strengthened. The effect did not follow the ribbon. The ribbon was only proving it. He checked his phone for wind data. The weather app showed mild temperatures and no alerts. If there was wind, it should have shown at least a few miles per hour. It showed nothing significant. He tried another source, then another, as if different apps might tell different truths. Later, when the case file was assembled, the nearest weather station's data matched what Garrett had felt on his face. Calm conditions, no meaningful gusts, no directional pattern that would pull a ribbon tight like a cable. Weather station shows calm. From station data, Garrett filmed again, longer this time, panning slowly to show the still trees, the unmoving leaves, the ribbon pulled rigidly in one direction. He added his own narration quietly into the recording, not as a performance, but as proof he had been present and thinking clearly. He attempted a few controlled variables. He tied a second ribbon farther up the trail where the ridge was not visible. That ribbon hung slack. He walked back down, tied a third ribbon where the ridgeline came into view again. That ribbon snapped tight the same way the first had. The pattern was not everywhere. It was specific. It had edges. Garrett's body began to notice things his eyes were still trying to deny. A faint pressure in the ears, like a change in altitude, without the climb. A subtle tug in the chest that did not feel like emotion, more like posture being gently corrected. When he stood facing the ridge, he had to resist leaning forward. He had maintained trails long enough to respect invisible hazards. You did not step onto a rotten log bridge just because it looked solid. You did not trust a slope that had slid once already. You did not ignore the first sign that something wanted you to move in a direction you had not chosen. He marked the spot with extra ribbon and backed away along the trail, measuring his steps the way people did when they wanted to keep panic from becoming speed. The farther he walked from the line of sight with that ridge, the less the pull pressed against his senses. When the ridge was hidden by trees again, the air felt normal and his breathing dropped from shallow to steady, without him noticing the moment it changed. Garrett reported the anomaly to the crew lead and included the video as documentation, expecting at most an argument about microclimates. The crew lead forwarded it to the ranger station because the ridgeline fell near an area with occasional closures for maintenance and unknown hazards. The ranger who responded did not laugh. The reply arrived as a short note attached to a service report that otherwise looked routine. It advised maintenance crews to avoid the ridge during certain conditions and referenced reports without specifying what kind. It was the kind of warning that made no sense unless it had been written for people who already knew. Ranger warns avoid ridge. From a service report in the days that followed, more fragments attached themselves to Garrett's video like burrs. A hiker called the station to report a strange sensation of being pulled off trail near the same ridgeline. Another mentioned that their campfire smoke had streamed sideways in a single ribbon while the leaves around them stayed still. A third described feeling as if the trail itself had a slope that was not visible, as if the ground wanted to tilt them toward the ridge when they weren't paying attention. None of them used the same language. They did not need to. The shape of the experience was the same. Garrett's ribbon video became the artifact that made the file easier to submit and harder to dismiss. Wind did not choose one ridge when the trees were still. Smoke did not behave like a guided thing without a draft to explain it. And a maintenance volunteer with no interest in drama did not start filming unless something had made him feel small in a familiar place. He did not return to that section alone. In later months, other crews reported finding ribbon tape already tied near that ridgeline, bright and fresh, knots tight, ends pulled straight toward the same direction as if someone had marked the hazard before them. Garrett could not confirm it was his ribbon. He had cut his down after filing the report. He had thrown it into his pack and carried it out, like evidence he didn't want to leave behind. Yet the ridge kept getting marked, and the pull, when the ridge was visible, remained constant enough that anyone who tied ribbon there learned the same lesson. Something in that valley air behaved like a system. It did not roar, it did not chase. It simply applied force in one direction, as if guidance could be delivered without words, and compliance could be measured by whether you leaned. Archival transition. The sixth file began with a lost hiker and became a missing time event documented by more than one system. Lena Bishop volunteered at a small clinic near a busy Appalachian trail junction where weekend hikers treated wilderness like a theme park and came back surprised that weather did not care about plans. She saw the predictable injuries, rolled ankles, cuts from bad knives, dehydration from filtered confidence, panic attacks that wore the mask of heart trouble. Every so often, someone arrived wrapped in emergency blankets with the wide-eyed stare of hypothermia, and the clinic did what rural clinics always did: stabilized, documented, handed off to the next link in the chain. The man named Colin Avery walked in alone on a bright afternoon in late summer and made the room go quiet without raising his voice. He was in his late 20s, dressed like a tourist who had purchased the outdoors as an idea. New boots, synthetic layers, a clean backpack that should have stayed clean, but his skin looked like it had been dragged through heat and grit. His neck was blistered in uneven patches, the kind of burns that came from prolonged exposure, not a single mistake. His hands were cracked at the knuckles. His lips were split in the corners. There was dried dirt under his nails, and it looked old, packed in by time and sweat, not by a single stumble. Lena asked the standard intake questions: name, date of birth, allergies, what happened. Colin answered with the stubborn calm of someone trying to keep his own story intact. He insisted he had only been out overnight. He said he had left the trailhead the previous evening, taken a short loop recommended online, and camped near a creek. He said he had woken in the dark to a strange sound and decided to hike back before sunrise. He said he had gotten turned around for a while, but it had been one night. One mistake, one bad morning. Nothing dramatic. His confidence did not match his body. His beard growth suggested days. Not heavy, not thick, but enough to make Lena's eyes measure time without thinking. His burns were too developed for a single night. His dehydration was not the shallow kind that improved after a bottle of water. It had the drawn quality of someone whose body had been rationing itself. Colin kept checking his phone as if it might explain him. He stared at the screen, frowning, then shook his head, then checked again, like the numbers were misbehaving. Lena asked to see it. The lock screen showed a date that did not match Colin's memory. The time was correct for the present moment, but the calendar was ahead by days. The device looked normal. The display was clean. No shattered glass, no water damage. It was the kind of phone you expected to find in a day pack at the end of a hike. Colin's thumb hovered over the screen as if he was afraid to unlock it, afraid of what he might see in his own photos. Lena called the sheriff's office because clinics in small counties learned to involve law enforcement early when a story began to fracture. A deputy arrived and took a statement while Lena started vitals and treated the burns. Colin's speech was clear, but his orientation wavered at the edges. He mixed up the order of simple events, then corrected himself with irritation, then went quiet as if the effort of holding his narrative together had become exhausting. In the deputy's report, the summary came out clean and blunt, the way official language tried to keep fear from becoming contagious. Subject missing 72 hours. From an incident report, Colin reacted badly to that phrasing. He insisted again it had been one night. He insisted he had not been missing. He had been hiking. He had been awake. He had been himself. Then, as Lena cleaned one blistered patch on the back of his neck, she found an abrasion that did not belong to the trail. It was a narrow line, too straight, as if skin had rubbed against smooth plastic or metal, not bark or rock. Similar abrasions ringed his wrists in faint arcs. Lena asked him to roll his sleeves up. That was when she saw the band, A pale strip of plastic sat around his left wrist, snug but not tight, like it had been adjusted by someone who cared about comfort. It had no logo, no barcode, no printed information. It was not the kind of wristband used by the clinic, not by the county hospital, not by any local event. It looked manufactured, clean, and uniform, yet it was scuffed in places as if it had been worn for several days. On the outer face, 3 shallow dots were pressed into the plastic in a straight line, subtle enough to miss if you weren't looking for pattern. Colin stared at it as if he had never seen his own wrist before. He could not explain it. He did not remember putting it on. He did not remember anyone else touching him. The clinic documented it the way clinics documented anything that might later become evidence. Lena photographed the band, noted its position, then asked the deputy to log it properly. Colin protested weakly, not because he wanted the band, but because the act of treating it like evidence made his situation real. Lena's medical intake note was careful and clinical, but it still carried the bluntness of what she had observed. Disorientation, burns. From a medical intake note, Colin's burns suggested sun exposure over more than a single morning. His dehydration suggested days without adequate water. His feet showed the early stage of trenching and blister breakdown that hikers usually developed after extended wet conditions, not a brief overnight. His backpack contained food wrappers that did not match a single evening's consumption. Some were older, crumpled, and refolded, as if he had rationed. His water bladder was empty and dry. He had no memory of rationing. He had no memory of running out. He kept returning to one detail, not as dialogue, but as a fixation. He said the woods had gone quiet. He said he had reached a place where the air felt still, thick, like the inside of a closed room. He said he had seen a line of white cloth tied to branches, leading him off the trail when he was sure he was walking the right direction. He said he had followed it because it felt like help. He could not say where it led. The deputy asked for last known location data. A request went out through the usual channels. In rural counties, missing time cases were often filed under exhaustion and confusion, then quietly forgotten. But the band and the date discrepancy and Colin's physical condition pushed the file into a different category, even if no one named it. A telecom operator later provided the device ping history. It showed Colin's phone moving off the known trail network and into deeper timber, into a tract with poor coverage and limited access. Then, for a stretch of days, there was nothing. No outgoing calls, no data, no location pings. Then, abruptly, the phone reconnected at a roadside pull-off near a county route, in a spot that did not match any path Colin said he had taken. The operator's summary was careful, but it contained the same uncomfortable implication. The phone had not wandered back by accident. It had returned to a place where it could be found. Last ping deep woods. From an operator record summary, Colin was stabilized and monitored for heat stress, infection risk in the burns, and dehydration complications. He slept in short bursts, waking confused, then calming, then reaching for his wrist as if checking the band was still there. At one point, Lena watched his fingers trace the 3 dots, over and over, like someone touching braille they did not understand. When he was discharged, he refused deeper interviews. He signed paperwork with a hand that trembled slightly. He kept his eyes down. He asked whether the clinic had removed the band. The deputy told him the band had been logged as evidence. Colin did not argue. His face tightened and something in his expression shifted from denial to resignation, like a person realizing that the proof of what happened to them no longer belonged to them. He left the county within a week. He did not answer follow-up calls. His social media went quiet. His employer later reported that he had resigned without explanation. The official file concluded with the usual language: probable disorientation, exposure, unreliable self-report due to stress. but the band remained in evidence storage, sealed in a clear bag with an inventory label and a date. It joined a growing list of artifacts from unrelated cases that shared a quiet signature. 3 dots pressed into plastic, 3 marks carved into metal, 3 taps captured faintly on recordings, a pattern that did not announce itself loudly, but repeated often enough to feel intentional. In the archive, Colin Avery became a line item that did not fit the county's usual missing hiker stories, not because he vanished, because he returned. Without 3 days. Archival transition. The 7th file contained a plaster cast that looked like a foot and did not look like a foot at all. Hank Rowe worked seasonal conservation patrols for a patchwork of county land and private timber leases, the kind of job that lived between polite public service and quiet enforcement. He spent his days checking gates, documenting illegal dumping, advising hikers who wandered off marked routes, and responding to landowners who treated every unfamiliar sound as a possible trespass. Over time, he learned the most useful skill in the mountains was not toughness, it was attention. Tracks were a language the land did not bother to translate. After rain, the ground held truth in high resolution. You could read weight by the depth of a heel, speed by the smear at the toe, hesitation by the way a print lingered and pivoted. Hank had grown used to being right about simple things. On a cool morning in early spring, 2 days after a heavy storm, a landowner called about barefoot tracks crossing a muddy access road near the boundary of a private tract. The caller sounded irritated more than afraid. People who owned land often believed they owned the right to never be surprised. Hank drove out expecting the usual: teenagers, a drunk camper, someone cutting across the wrong place after the creek flooded. Barefoot tracks were uncommon but not unheard of when people got wet and made bad decisions. The access road was a wide strip of mud and gravel that ran between hardwoods and a low fence line. The storm had softened everything. Tire tracks from a logging truck were still visible along the shoulder, and shallow puddles held thin skins of floating debris. The barefoot prints cut across the road in a straight line. Hank crouched, looking for the details that would confirm the obvious explanation. That was when his professional certainty faltered. The prints were barefoot. Yes, and the outline looked human at a glance. But inside each step was a second story layered on top of the first. The heels showed one pressure center, slightly inward, like a person who favored the inside of the foot. The ball of the foot showed another pressure center, slightly outward, as if a different body had stepped through the same skin. The toes were clear, but the toe pressure was wrong too, distributed as if the toes were both gripping and not gripping at the same time. It looked like one footfall and 2 gaits sharing it, refusing to separate. Hank moved to the next print to test his own mind. The same dual map appeared. He walked the line slowly, print to print, watching the mud repeat the anomaly with uncomfortable consistency. He documented it the way patrol training demanded: calm, thorough, boring. When something did not make sense, you removed the possibility that you had simply looked at it poorly. He marked the perimeter with flagging tape. He measured stride length. He noted the direction. He checked for any sign of approaching tracks from the ditch line, any evidence that the barefoot walker had stepped out of brush. There were none. The prints began in the center of the access road, as if someone had been placed there. They crossed a short distance, then ended in the center of the road, as if someone had been lifted away. No scuffs, no half-prints where a foot slipped at the edge, no return trail, no animal tracks overlaying them. The storm-soft mud that should have held 1,000 small stories held only this one, cleanly isolated. Hank radioed the situation up the chain. He kept his voice neutral, but the words came out carefully, like he did not want to animate the thing by describing it too vividly. unusual footprint morphology. From an evidence protocol, because the location sat near a private tract boundary, Hank treated it as potential evidence rather than a curiosity. He photographed each print with a measurement strip, multiple angles, and a scale marker, placed at the same orientation every time. The goal was to remove the ability for anyone later to say the camera had lied. Photos taken with scale. From a documentation note, he also photographed the surrounding road surface to capture the absence, because absence mattered as much as presence in the mountains. When there were no approach tracks, no departure tracks, and no accompanying marks, the scene stopped behaving like a trespass and started behaving like a placement. No other tracks. From a scene inspection, Hank had made casts before, usually for unusual animal prints or vandalism cases. Casting a barefoot track felt excessive, but the double pressure map made the decision for him. If the mud could hold the truth, plaster could hold it longer. He mixed the casting material in the back of his truck and poured it into a selected print that showed the dual gate most clearly. He watched it settle into the contours, filling the shallow toe ridges, hardening slowly as the morning air cooled. While the cast set, he walked the road again, widening his search radius. He checked the fence line for disturbance. He checked the nearby creek for washed-out tracks. He checked the slope where a person might have climbed in or out. He found nothing that connected to the prints. The land felt too quiet for an area that should have held birds and small animals after rain. Hank noted it without writing it down. Quiet was not evidence, but it was often the first symptom. When he returned to the cast, he lifted it carefully. The underside revealed the print in crisp relief, and the dual pressure ridges were even clearer in plaster than in mud. The heel ridge showed one center. The forefoot ridge showed another. The effect was not a blur or a double step. It was simultaneous. In the toe area, the cast held another detail that Hank would not have trusted without the plaster. 3 faint toe impressions were slightly deeper than the rest, not because the foot had 3 toes, but because 3 points had pressed with preference, like a tripod contact pattern. It was subtle. It could have been dismissed as soil variation if it had appeared once. It appeared in the next cast too. Hank cast a second print to confirm the toe pressure pattern. The same tri-point emphasis appeared, faint but consistent. He bagged both casts as evidence and labeled them with date and location. In the formal write-up, he described what he could justify: dual pressure mapping, isolated track line, absence of approach and departure. He did not write the part that stayed with him after he left the tract: the feeling that the access road had been used like a test surface. Mud was forgiving. Mud could be practiced on. Mud could be erased by the next rain. Before he drove away, Hank walked back to the first print in the line and stared at it until the shape stopped looking like a foot and started looking like an attempt at weight, an attempt at balance, an attempt at walking the way humans walked. He submitted the casts to the evidence locker and filed the report. The landowner was told it was likely a prank or a trespass. The file was categorized under unusual tracks, no suspect identified. But in the archive, the plaster casts sat in their boxes with the rest of the season's minor oddities, and they carried a detail that would become familiar across later cases: a quiet preference for 3 points, 3 marks, 3 beats of contact. Archival transition. The 8th file included an audio recording of a phone ringing in the woods where no line existed to carry it. Renee Caldwell did not hike for adrenaline. She hiked for angles and light, for the way Appalachia could turn ordinary decay into something patient and cinematic. She photographed abandoned spur lines and decommissioned grades where the forest had begun to reclaim the human idea of direction. Her favorite locations were the ones that barely counted as paths anymore: where moss covered old ties, where rusted nails held on to nothing, where the only sound was her own breathing and the distant, steady work of water. In late spring, on a weekday morning when the trailheads were empty, she followed a faint track off an old forest road she had found on a satellite layer. The spur line had once served logging crews. Now it served only deer, wind, and anyone with the bad habit of thinking forgotten places were harmless. Her phone had service at the road. It lost it within minutes of stepping under the canopy. Renee did not care. She had water, a compass, extra batteries, and the kind of calm that came from having been alone in the woods often enough to trust her own decisions. The spur grade curved gently downhill and then leveled out. She noticed the first wrong detail as a shape that held too many straight lines. A phone booth stood between two trees, upright as if it had always belonged there. It was the older kind, a box of metal and acrylic panels. The plastic was scratched but intact, clouded by age and impact. The door hung slightly off true, but it could have closed. The handset rested in its cradle. The keypad looked faded but not destroyed. Above it, a small plate where instructions should have been was blank. There were no power lines, no pole, no conduit, no sign of a trench, no buried cable marker, no nearby road pull-off where it might have been relocated from. The booth sat on bare forest ground, not bolted to concrete, not sunk into any foundation, as if it had been placed down gently and left to wait. Renee's first instinct was to treat it like a prop someone had dragged out for a prank. Her second instinct was to test that assumption by walking a slow circle around it, scanning for drag marks, crushed brush, fresh soil, any evidence that the booth had arrived recently by physical means. She found nothing that explained how it got there. The third instinct was the one she trusted most: evidence. She raised her phone and began recording. The lens caught the booth framed by wet leaves and thin spring fog. She stepped closer, careful, and the air inside the booth looked oddly still, like a pocket where the wind did not enter. Then the phone rang. It was not the faint ghost of sound carried on distance. It was immediate, loud, mechanical, insistently real. The bell tone came from inside the booth, the kind of ring meant to cut through traffic noise and pull a person toward it. It rang with the exact rhythm Renee remembered from childhood rest stops. Her skin tightened. Not fear yet, recognition. The unsettling feeling of something using a familiar mechanism on purpose. She kept recording because panic did not help, and proof did. Ringing captured from an audio clip on a mobile device. She did not step into the booth. She stood just outside the threshold, leaning in enough to see the handset and the cord. The cord was coiled, intact, but it did not disappear into any wall connection. It simply ran down into a cavity that should have led to wiring, and the cavity looked empty. The ringing continued with patient persistence, like a machine that did not understand doubt. Renee moved her camera closer to the keypad, trying to capture details. That was when she noticed the booth smelled faintly of old coins and wet plastic, a stale metallic tang that did not belong in clean forest air. She looked up at the blank instruction plate again. In the reflection on the acrylic, her face looked pale, flattened by the scratched plastic. The ringing stopped. For a moment there was nothing but the distant drip of water and her own breath. She held still, expecting the sound to begin again, expecting some prankster laugh to break the tension. Instead, the booth produced a different sound, a sharp internal click, then another. The coin return lever twitched once, as if moved by a hand, and the coin return tray opened. Something dropped into it with a small, precise metallic clink. Renee's stomach sank in a way that had nothing to do with superstition and everything to do with the simple math of cause and effect. She had not touched the booth. The booth had still interacted with the physical world. She angled her phone toward the tray. Inside sat a token. It was not US currency. It was not a modern arcade token. It had no year, no state, no obvious brand. One side was smooth except for a shallow stamped circle that looked like a border without a design. The other side held 3 small dots pressed into the metal near the edge, aligned neatly like a mint mark that belonged to no mint. The dots were so clean they looked intentional, a signature. Renee did not pick it up immediately. She filmed it first, moving the camera close enough to catch the scratches and the dull shine. The token sat still, waiting, like the booth had offered it as proof of transaction. Renee backed up 2 steps. She wanted space, but she did not want to lose sight of the booth. Her mind kept trying to settle on the most rational explanation. Old equipment, hidden battery, novelty installation, someone nearby controlling it. Then the phone rang again. This time the sound carried a different texture, not louder but more directed, as if the booth had adjusted the ring to match where Renee stood, like it was searching for the exact distance that would make her step forward. Her hands shook slightly as she ended the recording and started a new one. She wanted separate files, separate timestamps, separate pieces of proof. The ring stopped abruptly, mid-cycle, as if cut. A faint tone followed the open line sound you heard when a call had connected. The booth was not ringing anymore. It was offering the quiet that came after you answered. Renee leaned forward without stepping in and stared at the handset. Nothing moved. The handset remained in its cradle. The booth did not need her to physically lift it to behave as if she had. Her phone screen dimmed from inactivity. She tapped it awake and realized her signal indicator was not searching. It was blank, as if the phone had forgotten the concept of towers. Renee made a decision the way careful people did. She took the token as the artifact because leaving it felt like leaving a hook in her own skin. She did it quickly, with her sleeve pulled down, not because she believed in contamination in the paranormal sense, but because touching unknown metal in an unknown place was always a bad idea. The token was oddly warm for something sitting in shade. She backed away from the booth and began walking the spur grade back toward the forest road, faster now, no longer hunting for photos. The moment she reached a point where the canopy thinned, her phone signal returned in a hard jump, as if released. She called 911 while she still had bars, describing the booth with the controlled precision of someone trying to prevent her own words from sounding like a story. 911 call about phone in woods. From a dispatcher note, a deputy met her at the road and took her statement. Renee brought him back as far as she could without losing the path. The forest looked ordinary again, despite the booth's impossible geometry in her memory. They reached the spot. There was no booth, no flattened grass rectangle, no scrape marks, no acrylic shards, no metal base, not even a discolored patch where something had stood. The trees were the same, the air was the same, the ground was undisturbed, as if Renee had never stopped there at all. The deputy tried to keep his voice and posture neutral, the way professionals did when they suspected confusion or attention-seeking. He still recorded the coordinates. He still took the token as evidence because even skepticism had procedures. Later, an inspection team returned with basic equipment and a practical mindset. They documented what should have ended the mystery. No line present, no conduit, no buried cable, no battery pack, no modern hardware. No line present. From an inspection summary, the only physical thing that remained from the encounter was the token, sealed in an evidence bag that made it look more ordinary than it felt. Under fluorescent light, the 3 dots looked even cleaner. Renee's audio files survived too. The ringing in the clip was unmistakable. Not wind, not bird call, not a phone playing a sound through a speaker. It had the flat metallic insistence of a real bell. And there was something else, easy to miss unless you listened with headphones. Under the ring, barely audible, a soft click pattern that did not match the bell mechanism. 3 light ticks, a pause, 3 light ticks, like a quiet code trying to become a habit. Renee stopped hiking spur lines alone after that. She still photographed mountains, still chased fog and light, but she stayed on known trails where the forest behaved like forest. The case file listed the token as an unexplained artifact. In the notes, someone wrote one careful sentence that did not belong to any official template. The booth had offered a transaction without a caller, and if the next step required a name, the safest choice was to refuse to give one. Archival transition. The final file involved fabric markers that looked like trail guidance, but no trail existed to justify them. Dylan Shaw joined the volunteer search party because he had grown up in the kind of county where you helped when people went missing. You did not ask whether it was smart. You asked where to park, what channel the radios were on, and whether anyone had a spare headlamp battery. He had done shorter searches before, the routine kind that ended with a tired hiker embarrassed at the trailhead, dehydrated but alive. This one felt different from the briefing. 2 hikers had failed to return from a day route that should have been simple, a marked loop that climbed to a lookout and dropped back to a gravel pull-off. The weather was mild. Their plan was conservative. Their last known check-in placed them on schedule. When they missed their expected return window, the family waded through the normal excuses. When night came and the phones went silent, the county treated it as an incident. The staging area was a church parking lot at the edge of a hollow. Trucks lined up with hazard lights blinking. A ranger laid out a map on a folding table and spoke in the practical language of procedure. Last known location, likely path, water sources, ridgelines, drainages that pulled lost people downhill. Volunteers were assigned into small groups with one lead. Dylan's team was told to sweep a tract that sat just off the loop, an area of older timber where side paths sometimes tempted hikers into taking shortcuts that were not shortcuts. The first hour looked normal. Wet leaves, mossed rocks, a soft, cold smell like iron-rich soil. Dylan watched for the usual signs: snapped ferns, scuffed dirt, a torn snack wrapper, a boot print on a muddy bank. He found none. The forest surface looked untouched, as if no one had walked it in days. Then they found guidance. White cloth strips hung from branches at eye level, tied in clean knots, spaced with intention. Each strip was placed just far enough from the next that your eyes naturally jumped forward, the way you followed flagging tape on a work site. The fabric was bright, unweathered, the white too clean for a forest that stained everything. Even new cloth dulled quickly out there, soaked by fog and brushed by needles. These strips looked like they had been cut and tied minutes earlier. One of the volunteers said the obvious thing without meaning to make it dramatic. Someone had been here. Dylan's team lead did what trained people did. They stopped. They marked the spot. They photographed the first strip with a scale reference. They checked the ground beneath it. There was no trail, no scuffed leaves, no bent stems, no broken spider webs between saplings, no disturbed soil around roots. The markers hovered over untouched forest, like instructions meant for someone who did not leave tracks. A ranger report later used restrained language to document the same fact. Fresh fabric markers. From a ranger report, the team followed standard protocol anyway. They treated the markers as potential evidence of the missing hikers trying to self-rescue. They moved forward slowly, scanning both the line of cloth and the forest floor. Every volunteer knew the logic. If a lost person had the presence of mind to mark a route, you followed it. But as Dylan moved beneath the first few strips, the feeling in his body did not match the logic. The air felt slightly cooler under the cloth line, not colder the way shade was colder, but colder in a narrow corridor sense, like stepping into a draft that had direction even when the trees were still. It reminded him of Story 5's file note, the wind that pulled one way. He did not say that aloud. He did not want to infect the group with pattern thinking. He only tightened his grip on his flashlight and kept walking. The cloth led them into thicker timber, away from the marked loop and toward a drainage where the ground dropped in uneven steps. The strips continued with consistent spacing. The knots were identical. The placement was too neat for someone panicking. Dylan watched the group ahead. He noticed something subtle that made his mouth go dry. The cloth line did not weave around obstacles the way human flagging did. It ran straight, and when a limb blocked the ideal route, the next strip was simply tied higher, as if the maker had not needed to stand on the ground to reach it. The team paused to sweep for a campsite or shelter attempt. Nothing. No fire ring, no flattened bedding area, no food wrappers, no tiny scraps that even careful hikers left behind. The inspection notes later reduced that to a single sentence. No campsites nearby. From a field inspection mid-morning, the search had expanded. Another team reported hearing something like a distant metal tick through the radio static, but it did not repeat. The command post updated assignments. Dylan's group was told to keep tracking the cloth line, while a ranger unit tried to triangulate the last known ping from the missing hikers' phones. The pings did not help. The tract was a dead zone in the old, boring way, the kind Nolan had worked around. The difference was that the radios behaved strangely whenever the volunteers stood directly beneath the cloth strips. The audio did not just degrade, it sounded occupied, like the channel was being held open by a quiet pressure. Dylan took one strip down as evidence with the team lead's approval, using gloves and sealing it in a clean bag. Up close, the fabric had a faint smell of smoke and resin, like something stored near a fire without ever being burned. The cut edge was too straight, too clean, as if made with a sharp tool on a hard surface. The knots were tight and uniform. Dylan studied the knot pattern longer than he needed to. 3 tight wraps before the final tuck. Always 3. The preference for 3s appeared again with the same unnerving calmness it had carried through other files. A 911 log from earlier that week added a quiet layer. The command post did not want to say out loud, but someone printed it and clipped it to the packet anyway. Another hiker had reported being guided by cloth markers that appeared where there should have been none. The markers had led him away from his intended route, while his phone showed no service. He had turned back only when he realized the strips were not leading him to a trailhead, but deeper into a tract with no maintained exit. Hikers report being guided. From 911 log notes, as Dylan's team continued, the cloth line began to feel less like help and more like a corridor. The forest around it stayed normal in sound, but normal in a way that made the corridor stand out. Birds called off to the side, not overhead. Wind moved the higher canopy, but the cloth strips did not flutter. They stretched with a mild tension, not pulled by gusts, but held. The final marker appeared higher than the rest, tied to a branch well above head height. It hung over a steep drop where the forest fell away into a narrow drainage lined with slick stone and dark water. The line of cloth ended there, as if the maker had decided that was the point of transfer. Dylan and the team lead checked the ground, expecting signs of a fall or scramble. There were no tracks leading down, no torn fabric, no blood, no broken branches, no disturbed leaves where someone had slid. The lip of the drop was clean, undisturbed, as if the missing hikers had never reached it on foot. The marker was positioned to be seen from below, not from where Dylan stood, from beneath the drop, looking up, as if the forest wanted someone in the drainage to keep walking. Dylan felt the urge to call out the hikers' names, even though he knew it was useless. He did not. He remembered the phone booth file, the risk of giving a name to something that asked. He stayed silent and listened instead. For a moment, he thought he heard a thin sound from down in the drainage, not a voice, not a cry, but something like fabric shifting against itself. Then the sound stopped, and the only noise was water moving over rock. The search teams widened the grid and worked until daylight faded. Dogs were brought in, but the scent trails did not behave like scent trails. They would lock for a few yards beneath a cloth strip, then break clean as if the hikers had been lifted and carried somewhere air could not hold odor. Days passed. The two missing hikers were never found. What remained was the cloth strip in evidence, clean and too new, and a pattern that fit too well with other artifacts. The receipt that held one time, the band with 3 dots, the plaster cast that carried 2 gates in one footfall, the token with a foreign mint mark, the bridge scratch that looked like a signature rather than damage. A week after the search, the county quietly discouraged volunteer efforts in that tract. Officially, it was safety and terrain. Unofficially, it was the uncomfortable reality that the cloth markers made the forest feel organized, not haunted, not wild, organized. In the file summary, someone wrote a line that felt less like conclusion and more like caution. The entity behind these incidents did not rush like an animal. It behaved like a service. It posted signs, it created corridors, it held channels, it looped roads. It placed evidence the way a system left error logs, and when it wanted a person closer, it offered guidance that looked like help until you realized it was steering you away from every human path. The cloth strip, sealed in plastic, still smelled faintly of smoke and resin when Dylan was called back to the station weeks later to confirm chain of custody details. He stared at it through the bag and understood why it bothered him more than the missing hiker's silence. A missing person could be explained by accident, injury, weather, bad luck. Guidance meant intent. Black Pine Archives. Those were 9 case files from the Appalachian Mountains, each one partially verified through logs, reports, and artifacts that did not behave like mistakes. If one of these patterns felt familiar, it was because people reported them in different counties, different years, and different voices. But the marks stayed consistent. If this episode stayed with you, tell us which file hit the hardest and whether you have ever taken a road that seemed to learn you. Subscribe to Black Pine Archives for more archived case files, because the mountains did not need you to believe in them to make you disappear.